Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Our program is about to begin. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Our program is about to begin. Thank you. Please welcome to the stage ALEC Chief Executive Officer, Lisa B. Nelson.
Good morning. Good morning. Well, thank you for joining us this morning. I hope everyone enjoyed the Georgia welcome reception last night, and we were able to hear the great comments of Governor Kemp. As many of our Georgia legislators in the audience know, it is so important to have a strong chief executive to support you in your work. And our own Senate President Fan has the great pleasure of working with Governor Ducey in Arizona. And I know you Georgia legislators feel the same way about your great governor, Governor Kemp. Please welcome to the stage Reverend Bill Geisel of Capitol Commission, Tennessee, for our opening prayer. Thank you.
Good morning. I recently, in my role of encouraging legislators in the Tennessee General Assembly, have recognized that our ministry isn't simply when they're in session, but year-round when they're in their districts. So with that effort, I thought recently I would start to send them on a Monday morning for their week a text that would be brief, but it would encourage them. And so for those that have entrusted me with their phone numbers, and for those that have said, don't blow up my phone, for the two that were remaining, I send this out. But I thought this week, this might be an encouragement to you as well before we pray. It says, when we pray, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, we are not asking for God to swoop us up to heaven where his will is done perfectly. We are taking note of the downward movement of the kingdom in its presence and reality breaking into this world. Salvation is far more than going to heaven when I die. This world is where God's kingdom is coming, and we are commissioned ambassadors of that kingdom here and now in these bodies. To be ambassadors of this kingdom means to care deeply about bodies and the forces of death that oppose them. It is about engaging the real-life issues that bombard us, issues like political corruption, racial reconciliation, grieving neighbors, trafficked human lives, splintered families, and lives of the unborn. Things where people in human skin are affected, not just souls in the afterlife. Be that kind of ambassadors in your role as a legislator. Go do good in this world where the kingdom of God is breaking in through you. Thank you for all the things you do to serve all God's children, things seen and unseen, but never missed by your Father in heaven. Let's pray. Our Father and King, thank you for the privilege and the responsibility to be servants of yours in this unique role for these men and women who are not only elected by their constituents, but selected by the King of Heaven to do good in this world. I pray for them as they face both opportunity and opposition. We pray that the enemy would not have opportunity against them and that you would grant to them wisdom and discernment, grace and courage. And on this day where you have set out divine opportunities for us to learn, to be shaped, to be empowered, may the breath of heaven fill them with encouragement. And may you bless them and that every step of their feet, may the work of their hands, the meditation of their heart be acceptable in your sight. O God, our rock and our Redeemer, we pray in the name of your Son. Amen.
Thank you, Reverend. Those are beautiful words. Well, as I said, I hope everyone had a chance to enjoy the welcome reception, and as well, the ALEC Draft House. We had the panel on the Hong Konger with Jimmy Lai. For those of you who have not seen the Hong Konger, the movie, I urge you to do so. Jimmy Lai serves as a beacon of hope for people around the world who struggle to be free and look to the West, to the United States, and to all free societies for the opportunity to recognize their God-given talents and gifts. The film should also serve as a reminder of the evils of communism, statism, and President Reagan's warning that freedom is only one generation away from extinction. And here at ALEC, we have seen firsthand the strategy behind cancel culture, and we thank the people who have stayed with us and not buckled to pressure. We stand with Jimmy Lai and all the people who yearn to be free while we continue to defend freedom here in America. It's important to remember that repression and the enemies of free society have many faces, whether they be the CCP, who stifle free speech of the citizens and journalists in Hong Kong, or anti-capitalist activists who use coercion and fear to stifle free markets, investors, and companies in the United States. It's therefore altogether fitting that we continue today's breakfast program with our next guest. Vivek Ramaswamy is the co-founder and executive chairman at Strive Asset Management. He's also the author of the book Nation of Victims, Identity Politics, the Death of Merit, and the Pushback to Excellence. He also wrote Woke Inc., has been on multiple television shows in recent months, an outspoken critic of stakeholder capitalism and critical race theory. Mr. Ramaswamy was born and raised in Ohio, attended Harvard University and Yale Law School. Please join me in welcoming Vivek Ramaswamy.
Yes. Right. Thank you for that warm welcome, Lisa. I'm going to actually, given this audience here, get right into the meat of a number of issues that we'll spend the next half hour or so getting right into. So I'm going to start by telling a story about the origin of the spread of stakeholder capitalism, known to you as woke capitalism, the mixture of progressive agendas, and the advancing of those progressive agendas through big business. But I'm going to ask you to keep one thought in the back of your minds, which we'll come back to at the end, which is the role of states in addressing this problem. And I'm going to end on an optimistic note, I promise you, that I think that states can actually be the agents of positive change to solve this problem, both by wearing their hat as lawmakers, but also by wearing your hats as market participants. And I'm going to come back to that at the end, but I'll ask you to keep it in mind for the duration of the talk. So the story I'm going to tell you first begins with the 2008 financial crisis. Many of you remember that. I remember it well. It was actually in the fall of 2007 that I got my first job out of college at a hedge fund in New York City, right on the eve of the 2008 crisis. Very interesting time to get a job in the finance industry. I remember it well. What happened in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis is the public's perception of Wall Street and big business changed dramatically in those 2 years. And in my opinion, for good reason. Because bankers made a lot of money when times were good. They got bailed out by the public fisc when times went bad. And so in the aftermath of those bailouts, Occupy Wall Street was on Wall Street's doorstep. What they wanted was change in their expectation from American capitalism. And what the old left wanted to do, agree or not, was to then take money from those wealthy corporate fat cats and to redistribute it to poor people to help poor people. Agree or not, that's what they had to say. That is part of what led to the birth of a new movement in this country, though, because there was a new wing of that left right around that same time that had a slightly different agenda. It was not to address poverty or economic injustice like most of the old left. like the Occupy Wall Street left. But it was to also say that actually the real problem was also racial injustice and misogyny and bigotry and the racially disparate impact of climate change. And that actually presented the opportunity of a generation for Wall Street and big business in this country to be able to say that, you know what? I don't know if I love the Occupy Wall Street demands, but that new left's demand I can actually get on board with. I can applaud diversity and inclusion. I can put some token minorities on my board. I can muse about the racially disparate impact of climate change after flying on a private jet to Davos. This is actually pretty good work, if you can get it. But it came with a catch. It came with an implicit demand that the new left look the other way when it came to leaving that corporate power structure intact. And I think that was the arranged marriage that defined the trend that we've seen over the course of the next 14 years thereafter, neatly wrapped around with three-letter acronyms: SRI, from socially responsible investing, to ESG, environmental, social, and governance factors, to CSR, corporate social responsibility, to my favorite one, CCP, which you all know well, and I think has been a separate agenda that's actually been advanced, which we'll come back to. But this trade worked so well for Wall Street and the big banks to defang the Occupy Wall Street movement, to defang the old economic redistributionist left, to focus on the new identity politic obsessed left. That worked so well. Talk about systemic racism all you want, as long as you don't talk about systemic financial risk. That worked so well that actually Silicon Valley then observed that and got in on the act. Because what Silicon Valley recognized in this country was that prior to 2010, the biggest threat to monopoly power in Silicon Valley, the old version of the breakup big tech, actually came from the left. So what they recognized was that we can enter the same implicit transaction to say that, you know what? We will lend our corporate power in service of advancing the ends of that left, but we will not do it for free. We effectively expect that the new left look the other way when it comes to leaving our monopoly power intact. We will take down hate speech and misinformation and content as you wish to define it that others should not see on the internet. Whatever needs to be done by way of content moderation, we will do. But again, we have an implicit quid pro quo in return, and that is the autonomy from the demands of that old left to continue aggregating that level of monopoly power. See, that is the defining trade that I think drove the merger of corporate power and state power over the course of the last decade and a half in this country. And it worked so well, starting on Wall Street, and then it worked so well for Silicon Valley, that that's when the rest of corporate America then decided to get on the train. Coca-Cola issuing new statements about voting laws in Georgia, many of you are familiar with, that make it sound more like a super PAC than a soft drink manufacturer, teaching its employees how to be less white, all the while saying nothing and avoiding the conversation about their own products' impact on the nationwide epidemic of diabetes and obesity, including in the black community that they profess to care so much about. Nike, criticizing slavery 250 years ago in the United States to no end, while actually doing nothing to reduce their own reliance on slave labor today to produce $250 sneakers that they sell to those black kids in the inner city who can't afford to buy books for school. This was a game that worked out pretty well for both sides. It was an arranged marriage, okay? I use this term intentionally. My parents had an arranged marriage. It actually worked out really well. I've grown more partial to the model as in my adult life, if you learn, think about it a little bit. But this was not the arranged marriage of love, okay? This was an arranged marriage of convenience. It was an arranged marriage in which each side actually didn't love the other side. They secretly had disdain for the other side. But they got into the relationship anyway. It was more like mutual prostitution because each side got something out of the trade. And the net result was the birth of this new woke industrial complex, a new force, a new Leviathan in modern American life that was far more powerful than what Thomas Hobbes envisioned 400 years ago, far more powerful than what our founding fathers envisioned 250 years ago when they put into motion a three-part system of government with checks and balances, not envisioning a fourth branch of government in the private sector itself that would suck the lifeblood out of the constitutional government that we put into motion. And it is a new monster that actually duped both sides into submission. The old left that used to be skeptical about the aggregation and misuse of corporate power was defanged and deflected by the fact that actually they were distracted by the fact that these new guys are going to advance the causes, the progressive causes that we love so much, that they forgot about their principled opposition to settling political questions through corporate power. And for the conservative wing's part, conservatives were duped into submission by memorizing and reciting slogans that we all memorized back in the 1980s, saying that the free market can do no wrong, without recognizing that that free market does not exist today. And that's the story of how both sides actually contributed to the creation of possibly the most powerful force in modern American life, this merger of state power and corporate power. And it got a little bit worse in the last few years because there was another cynical force behind the scene, not just the financial interests of domestic firms here at home, but more importantly, the sovereign interests of another market actor on the other side of the Pacific. That was the Communist Party of China. And what they recognized is that this spread of apologist capitalism, I don't even call it woke capitalism, I want to be very specific, apologist, self-critical capitalism here in America, presented the opportunity of a generation for advancing Chinese interests. That might sound ridiculous. How could that be? These are two different topics, right? Not quite. What they recognized is this was an opportunity to use multinational corporations that are based here in the United States to undermine the greatest geopolitical asset that America ever had. And I will give you a clue: that is not our nuclear arsenal. It is our moral standing on the global stage. What they recognized is that if we could get America's own companies to erode, chip away at that asset, our moral standing, then China actually creates a false moral equivalence between the US and China. I'll explain to you how it works. Actually, it becomes very simple if you just listen to Xi Jinping, by the way. The first thing he says, every time he's pressed about the Uyghur human rights crisis in the Xinjiang province, where there are over 1 million Uyghurs enslaved in concentration camps, subject to forced sterilization, communist indoctrination, and worse, the first thing that he says is that Black Lives Matter shows that the United States is no better. Exactly, according to his translator, at least, that's what he says. His top diplomat, though, this is not an accident. This is a planned vision. If you look at the internal documents inside the Chinese Communist Party, this is consistent with their strategy. Their top diplomat came to the Alaska summit last year, spoke to Tony Blinken, who was so surprised he couldn't even blink an eye. Okay, first thing he told him for 15 minutes is that China wants to see the U.S. do better on human rights, and that China wants to see the U.S. stop slaughtering, that is his word, slaughtering Black Americans. This would be laughable if it weren't for the fact that our own corporations lend implicit moral credibility to those claims by relentlessly criticizing social injustice here at home and taking steps even in our sphere of government to advance that self-critical vision in America, without saying a peep about the actual human rights atrocities abroad. Microaggression obsession here at home, willful blindness to the actual macroaggressions abroad. I don't even need to go through the list of examples here. You're all familiar with, I'll just give you one to make this really real. Take Disney, right? You know what Disney did this year? The national campaign they've pledged to for transgender education and gender identity amongst first, second graders and kindergartners. I frequently said the bill shouldn't have been called Don't Say Gay. It should have been called, by the media, Wait Till 8, as in, wait till you're 8 years old. We need to get better at rhyming our laws. That might be one of the lessons that we learn as state legislators. But put that to one side. That's the campaign that Disney goes on. A couple years ago, they did the same thing in the state of Georgia, by the way. They said they couldn't film in the state of Georgia if Georgia passed the equivalent of a heartbeat bill, an anti-abortion statute. That's what Disney does here at home. Last year, they go to literally ground zero of that Uyghur human rights crisis, to Xinjiang in China, and film Mulan without saying a peep until the very end of the movie. You can still see it in the credits today. they mustered up the courage to say, we thank the local authorities for allowing us the privilege of filming here. The very authorities who are responsible for the largest scale subjugation of human beings as slaves on the planet. That's Disney. Nike, Airbnb, BlackRock, you name it. The NBA, this is the trend. And you ask yourself why it is these companies behave this way. It's actually pretty simple. It comes down to money. At the end of the day, China builds a great Chinese wall that prevents American market actors from entering the Chinese market if they criticize the CCP. But they quietly roll out the red carpet if you are also criticizing the United States. And that's the game they have played, recognizing that China was never going to defeat the US militarily, just as Greece was never going to defeat Troy militarily. What Greece recognized is that he couldn't beat Troy from the outside. You use the Trojan horse to undermine it, to burn Troy from within. And that's really the playbook from which China has taken its page, recognizing that they could use global capitalism itself as the Trojan horse to weaken the foundation of America's competitive advantage, where we thought, and by we I mean both Democrats and Republicans back in the 1990s, that we could use trade, that we could use global capitalism, that we could use our investment, our dollars, to get them to be more like us. What a flaw that was. What they realized over the last 30 years, much sooner, they've been practicing it over the last 30 years, is that they could use their money, access to their market, to get us to be more like them. Or even better, more accurately, use our money to get us to be more like them, and it has worked. Where we thought we could send Big Macs and Happy Meals and somehow that was going to spread democracy to places like China, what they realized is that they could actually send back those Disney movies and Nike sneakers as Trojan horses to undermine the United States from within and create that false moral equivalence between American idealism and Chinese nihilism. So that's the scale of the problem. It's not just a trend in cultural trend in markets here at home. It is a cultural trend that goes to the essence of preserving both capitalism and democracy. The stakes for capitalism are the focus of companies themselves. We will see in a matter of minutes, if not already while I'm on the stage, what the GDP numbers were as to whether or not we are in a technical recession. Diversity is conformity, inclusion is exclusion. We say war is peace, and a recession is something other than 2 consecutive quarters of GDP decline, apparently. But that's where we are here at home. And yet, at the same time, we actually are contributing to that very agenda that's eroding our economic foundation by refocusing companies away from what companies are supposed to do. Provide products and services for profit through a system that we call capitalism, the best known system to mankind to lift people up, including people up from poverty. This new trend not only undermines capitalism's ability to deliver on that promise, but it also undermines democracy's ability to deliver on its promise, where every citizen is given an equal voice and equal say, not on what products rise to the top of the market, that's what free market capitalism does, but on what ideas rise to the top of a democracy. How we address, whether we address global climate change, systemic racism, whatever, these are important questions that every citizen has an equal stake and an equal voice and say in determining the answer to. But by delegating that answer to a small group of capitalist elites, we drain the lifeblood out of both capitalism and democracy, with deep-seated geopolitical implications that actually advantage our greatest geopolitical foe and threat over the course of the next several decades in that process. That's how deep this problem runs. Now, I promised you in the second half of this talk we would get to the solutions. And I think the solutions and the path to solutions are bright, especially if this group of people is able to play a leadership role in delivering it. I think the answer to this problem rests not at the federal government, but with the states. And I think each of you wear two hats, both of which I think can be powerful levers for change. Both your hat as a lawmaker that corrects some of the misbehaviors we see in the market, some of the betrayals we see of those market principles from within the market itself. But also, and this is probably the most important part of this because it doesn't get discussed enough, also wearing your hat as market actors, which I'm going to come back to at the end. Wearing your lawmaking hat, one of the things I say is we actually have an opportunity in a bipartisan sense to restore the basic American vision of both pursuing the American dream and expressing yourself at the same time as a free citizen by putting some basic ideas back into motion, like protecting free expression in the private sector. I think states have an opportunity to recognize what the authors of the civil rights statutes accidentally left as their unfinished work back in 1964. To say that if you cannot discriminate against somebody on account of their race or their sex or their sexual orientation or their national origin or religion, then you should not be able to discriminate against somebody on account of their political beliefs, their expressed political beliefs either. Now, I bring this example up because it's the kind of conversation we ought to be having. It puts pressure on the classical 1980s style wisdom. I used to call myself a libertarian myself. The kind of wisdom that says that the free market should be able to solve this problem. The last thing we should want to do is impose another constraint on what a private business can and can't do. This is compelling. I used to think this way myself. However, the overarching lesson I'll leave with you is that the free market cannot fix what it is not free to fix. You cannot apply these standards without an even hand to say that if we're not going to allow businesses to be able to make judgments on who they work with on account of a wide range of other parameters, if we say that you can't fire somebody or deplatform somebody because they're black or gay or Muslim or white or Christian or Hindu or Jewish or whatever, we've got to say that you also should not be able to fire somebody or deplatform somebody just because they're an outspoken conservative or an outspoken liberal for that matter. You cannot have it both ways. Maybe we can actually go back to a world where we trust the market to do its work and to say that if these businesses are firing people for political reasons or for racial reasons, that creates a great opportunity for these other businesses to hire them. That's a coherent worldview in my opinion. But we can't create a situation where, and I've seen this in the private sector, where the civil rights statutes and the protected classes that we created around them actually put into motion the very basis for rampant viewpoint-based discrimination we see in the private sector today. I'll be more specific. Where 60 years of expanded jurisprudence, including by the Supreme Court for many of those decades, was a culprit in this, said that the civil rights statutes, protected classes of race and gender and now sexual orientation and religion and national origin, didn't just mean you couldn't discriminate. It also meant that you could not express or create a hostile work environment, that you could not create a harassing environment, where a hostile work environment actually includes the expression of certain contrary viewpoints to what was presumed to be the view of that protected class. So in the very process of putting those market restrictions into motion, we actually created the groundwork for the rampant viewpoint-based discrimination we see in the private sector today, while leaving viewpoint-based discrimination unprotected. So what I say is you can't have it both ways. Either we trust the market or we apply those standards even-handedly, but we cannot use the law to constrain the free market's ability to actually be a free market without finishing our homework on the other end of it. That is a debatable proposition. The idea of making political belief a protected class and a civil right at the state level, that is a debatable proposition. I think that is the debate, though, that we need to be having to unshackle ourselves from 1980s style orthodoxies, reminding ourselves, as Abraham Lincoln reminded his compatriots 160 years ago, that the dogmas of a quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. And what I say is that the dogmas of 1980 for the conservative movement are inadequate to meet the unique challenges of 2022. So these are the kinds of debates that I think we ought to be having as policymakers that wear the first hat of solving the problem created in the market by the law through additions to the law or subtractions from the law, but changes to the law nonetheless that help solve the spread of this new cultural virus in American capitalism. I think there's an even more promising solution, however, and that is to solve this same problem wearing your hat not as market regulators, but as market actors. And this story traces actually back to one of the invisible problems that has actually been hiding in plain sight. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. It is the problem created in American capitalism today by the one industry that is upstream of all of the others. That is the asset management industry, the industry that directs the flow of capital into every other major industry. Okay. It reveals the farce of the idea that we live in a modern free capitalist society when a small handful of market actors, as few as 3 in the case of the passive asset management industry, are the effectively controlling owners of the allegedly competing companies across our sectors: Apple and Microsoft, Coke, Pepsi, Disney, Paramount Pictures, Exxon, Chevron. We think these companies compete against each other. Well, maybe they do in the marketplace of products, but they don't in the marketplace of ideas. Ask yourself why. Their top shareholders are the same institutions: BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. Just those 3 firms manage over $22 trillion. That is more than the GDP of the United States. And what they're doing is that they're using the force of that capital, that shareholder power, to actually force these companies in the boardroom to behave in the very ways that I'm describing, including the disparate behavior with respect to the United States and China. Because many of those asset management firms, starting with BlackRock, see their own biggest growth opportunities actually by doing business in China. BlackRock happens to be the first foreign owner of a domestic asset management subsidiary business in China. They did not get that without meeting the CCP's conditions. But American capitalism is left holding the bag when these $22 trillion behemoths are actually driving this corporate behavior behind the scenes. And what I just described to you there is perhaps the largest scale fiduciary breach in the last century, where this isn't George Soros we're talking about using his own money, $20 billion or whatever, his own money. We're talking about a small handful of firms using $20+ trillion of your constituents' money, their money, the citizens' money, our money, to advance agendas in corporate America's boardrooms, politicized social agendas in corporate America's boardrooms, that most of the ultimate owners of capital, the everyday citizens of this country, actually disagree with. That is the largest scale fraud, not just financial fraud, but ideological fraud of our century. And no one has seriously stepped up to do something about it yet. That's the opportunity hiding in plain sight. And as I said, once you see it, you can't unsee it. A small group of actors using $20 trillion of citizen money to advance political and social agendas through our system of free market capitalism that most of those citizens actually disagree with. And it is happening at such a large scale that it even presents an anti-competitive problem. I'm mostly an antitrust skeptic. I'm just going to put that on the table. But I'll tell you, if antitrust law is to police any problem, this is close to the top of that list. Where, imagine if you got the CEOs of Exxon and Chevron and ConocoPhillips and a few more, add a few more to the list, BP, Shell, et cetera, put them in the same room. And together they decided that, we're going to cut gas production. And we're going to see gas prices go up at the pump, but we're going to dress that up and say we're doing it to advance the social good. That would be a cut and dry price fixing violation. Handcuffs, this would be the stuff of movies, people going to jail for that type of price fixing violation. Yet the top shareholders of those firms mandate that they do the exact same thing, and somehow we celebrate that as ESG instead. That's a problem. It's a problem hiding in plain sight, but the reason it's hiding is it's been wrapped with the veneer of virtue and morality that's been a tripwire to the systems of accountability. And the worst part of this problem is that it also comes with deep-seated conflicts of interest. So many of those projects that say Exxon drops, and this is a true story, right? Exxon has reduced its oil production targets by about 20% from its prior forecasts after BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard just a year and a half ago put new directors onto Exxon's board to revise its climate change strategy. Imagine what that's doing to gas prices now, reducing U.S. supply of oil, not because of a technical Biden administration policy, but because of a private sector ESG policy. Ask yourself who's at the front of the line to pick up some of those very projects. It's actually firms like PetroChina that would be well positioned to pick up those projects. But then, and this is a fun fact not a lot of people know, you look up who's the top shareholder or among the top shareholders that own 6% of PetroChina, it's actually none other than BlackRock. So think about this, the large asset management complexes that demand that the US behave and US companies behave in a certain way to stave off global climate change are actually giving the projects effectively from the left hand to the right, while the American consumer and the American investor, and most importantly, the American citizen, are left holding the bag. Now, where the story takes a surprising turn is that it's easy for us to criticize BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard as the other. As far as I know, they're not in this room, okay? And if they are, that's fine. I gave a talk yesterday where someone from BlackRock was in the room. We had a great conversation on the back of it. I'm fine. We'll say the same thing both ways. But here's the part you don't expect. Our states are in many cases behaving in the same way. 2 red states, Florida's one of them, and this is surprising, actually voted for those same directors onto Exxon's board. Voted against the recommendation of Apple's management. Keep in mind, this is a progressive company, made 9-figure donations to BLM and related movements. Apple's management team recommended against a shareholder proposal that called for a regularized racial equity audit at Apple. And states, including red states, ended up being the ones who voted for that proposal at actually the equivalents at places like, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, you name it, in terms of many other companies. So, Facebook had a shareholder proposal for the renomination of 2 of its longstanding directors, Peter Thiel and Mark Andreessen, that one red state voted against, but also voted for in that same election to appoint a civil rights representative to its board. So this isn't BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard I'm talking about anymore. This is U.S. states, and not just U.S. states, but red states in this country. That's a problem, but the good news is that's an easy problem to solve. And I think that this is where the future rests. The next wave, the next 5 years of solving this problem rests in your hands by recognizing that historically the market actors, the asset managers that the financial institutions of this country have catered to are market actors like CalSTRS, the state of New York, where what they did about 10 years ago was to start to tell these financial institutions and asset managers that we only want to do business with a firm that advances the vision and way of the future. And you know what? We're the biggest ones, so you have to pay attention to us. And quietly what happened is everyone else got taken for a ride along the way. I think if the rest of the states, in between, geographically and otherwise, those states, recognize that the collective market power of the citizens represented by those other states is being disrespected, those states can actually band together and take back that market power to say that our pension funds, our state treasuries, the state aggregated capital of citizens in those countries will not be used to advance these agendas. And I think that is the lowest hanging fruit for how we're able to drive this change, not by making laws regulating how companies behave or not. All laws have unintended consequences when regulating the market. But by taking back the market power that already belongs to the states and citizens themselves. And to me, this is not just a choice. This is mandatory because it's not even your money or the money of the people who sit in this room. It's the money of your citizens, your constituents, that's being used to advance this agenda, defrauding them of not just their money, but their voice and their very identity as well. And I think there is an opportunity for state legislatures to look within, to not just point our finger at the other, but to look deeply at what we see in the mirror and find the parts that we don't like and have the courage to fix that within. There is a managerial cancer pervading the government, and those of you in this room are part of the politically accountable class, and with that designation comes both great power and great responsibility to make sure that the class within your state that is not politically accountable, that is appointed on a pension fund board, that even less accountable works at an investment staff overseen by that board, understands that they too are accountable to the very people who you serve rather than to their own objectives and their own vision of crony capitalism that was born through the relationship with the financial sector over the course of the last decade. So I hope we get into some of that discussion in our panel. This is the promising way of states actually driving change to the problem of woke capitalism. It will not be a U.S. president. It will not be the U.S. Congress. It will not be a U.S. Senate that solves this problem. I think it will be state legislatures and state executive leaders across the country. And I hope that that begins starting now. So thank you, and I look forward to the panel. Thank you. Wow.
How about that, ladies and gentlemen? Wasn't Vivek great? Well, and even news to Vivek that broke while he was up here, as you probably saw on your news feeds in the last few minutes, we announced negative 0.9% GDP growth for the second quarter. That is breaking news. And to discuss that really precarious situation that we face as a U.S. economy today, I'd like to welcome to the stage our great friends, Steve Moore and Andy Puzder, who I think are two of the best thought leaders on this. Do you follow them? Aren't they great? And they're great friends of ALEC, they're great personal friends, they're mentors of mine, and Andy's been in this. In fact, as we talked a lot about ESG throughout this week, Andy was one of the very first people in the country to identify ESG and radicalized ESG as a problem. And of course, he's longtime CEO of CKE, Hardee's and Carl's Jr., has been affiliated with many of our friends around Washington, such as the Heritage Foundation, and has been a frequent helper to us at ALEC working with state legislators. And of course, Steve Moore really needs no introduction to this group. He's a frequent ALEC speaker, sits on our ALEC Private Enterprise Advisory Council, and is such a great friend and a co-author of our Rich States, Poor States report, which, by the way, at your tables, you have the brand new full 14th edition of Rich States, Poor States. So make sure to pick one up before you leave. So, gentlemen, well, I think I have to say this. Utah is #1 for every single edition of Rich States, Poor States. So where's our Utah table? I think I see it right there. So, gentlemen, let me start with this. We saw these horrible numbers. We're almost facing a stagflation. We are facing stagflation for the first time since the Jimmy Carter era. What in the world is going on with the economy today? And maybe, Steve, we'll start with you and go to Andy from there.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Lisa, for the great job that you do. Doesn't Lisa Nelson do an amazing job as the president of this great group? Thank you, Lisa. It's so wonderful to see. I think there are like 600 people in this room, which is more people than the total number of people who signed up for CNN Plus. So that's pretty amazing, isn't it? Okay, so look, this economy is in some deep, deep trouble. I just brought a couple of quick slides I wanted to show you because we're seeing this continued trend of people moving out of blue states into red states, and you can see that, if anything, that's accelerating. I hope, for those of you, how many in this room are from Illinois, California, or New York? Any legislators? I'm sorry. It's just not going well there. But, this is the trend that is actually speeding up. It's not falling. And then, if you'll just show this next chart, this is really, hold on, we've lived through this 2 years of COVID, and I want to just applaud the legislators in this room from the red states. But you can see we did with ALEC a grading of how states dealt with the crisis. And you can see the states in green are the ones who did it right, and the states that are in red, and you see that one state that's in black, that's New Jersey, which gets an F-. But you can see that a clear pattern here. And I want to make one point really clear, because this is really critical, because what's happening in California right now, where they're talking about more shutdowns. Never, never, never again should we allow the government to shut down our schools. Never again should we allow them to shut down our businesses. Never again should they be allowed to shut down our churches. It was a catastrophic policy, never again. So just moving on, can you show the next one? You can see, our states are doing so much better on unemployment. And this has been consistent for the last 2 weeks. This shows so clearly, Jonathan, that our ideas are working. Right to work, lower tax rates, less regulation, all these things matter, and you can see the states that are just stuck at the bottom, and that's a tragic situation. I'll say one thing about inflation, then I'll turn it over to you, Andy. This inflation is a cancer cell in our economy. The nominal GDP grew by 8%, which is normally a really, really good number. The problem is when you have 9% inflation, a lot of Americans think it's higher than that. You just can't get out of this. I mean, most of us at this table, I think, Jonathan, you were too young, lived through the 1970s when you just had this, it destroys the stock market, it destroys businesses, it destroys family finances. The average family has lost $4,000 of income this year under Joe Biden. So inflation is not just bad for the overall economy. It hurts the lowest income people the most, which is so ironic, right? Because all the left talks about is inequality, and their policies have created more inequality. One last thing, and I'd love your thoughts about this, Andy. I literally could not sleep last night. I was so upset about what happened yesterday with this news about a potential deal between Joe Manchin and Chucky Schumer to do another $1 trillion spending bill. We need, Lisa, all hands on deck to stop this atrocious bill. This is one of the worst bills I've ever seen. It doubles the IRS budget. It has a massive tax increase on our businesses, Andy. They want to give $30 billion more to the Department of Energy, all on and on and on and on. I still think we can defeat this, but we need a wholesale, our whole movement behind stopping this bill, because it will douse a forest fire of inflation with kerosene if we allow that bill to pass. So let's, Andy, make that a high priority, and I'm happy to turn it over to you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think there really is a broader picture here than just this bill. The bill is a terrible idea. But think about where we are. We're right now in a situation where we have incredible inflation because demand is up here and supply is down here. Now, there's two things you can do. You can reduce demand, which is very painful for the people that are creating the demand, which is us. It's consumers. It's your constituents. So we're going to the Fed is causing that pain. What sense does it make? While the Fed is causing the pain of trying to reduce spending, reduce demand, for us to spend another $500 billion. I mean, the problem is we spent $1.9 trillion back in March of 2021. And if you look at the graph on inflation, you can see it just as Larry Summers predicted. It spiked as soon as we passed that bill. What sense does it make to spend more money while the Fed's trying to drag demand down by reducing consumption? At the same time, what we should be doing is driving demand down. The Fed's doing what it should do. We're in trouble. They need to do this. They maybe need to do more of it. On the other side, though, to reduce the pain of bringing demand down, we should be increasing supply. What we learned in the Trump administration is it doesn't matter how high demand is. If supply can meet it, you don't have inflation. You just have to have supply meet demand. So let's get supply up. Well, how do you do that? Well, you don't do it by imposing more taxes, as this bill would do. You might do it by making the tax cuts that are out there permanent. That would help. You don't do it by increasing regulation, which discourages businesses from growing, which is what the Biden administration has been doing. You do it by focusing on domestic energy production, which could bring down fuel prices, which affect the price of everything. So if we did some supply side economics at the same time, we were driving down demand, we might find that we didn't have to drive it down as far as we're now going to have to. So why, with the numbers you see from Steve, and with what I just said to you, which I think is patently obvious to anybody that took a high school economics course, if it's that obvious to everybody, why are they doing this? And I think Brian Dees was on TV a couple of weeks ago on CNN. He was asked about how these high oil prices were affecting regular Americans. And Brian Dees is a member of the President's National Economic Council. He's a high-level economic advisor to President Trump. He was asked, what do you say about these high oil prices affecting average Americans? And he said, well, this is about preserving the liberal world order. Mm-hmm. Now, if that doesn't tie into what Vivek said, I don't know what does. Right. That's what this is about. These people they know what they're doing. You have to be really stupid not to know what you're doing if you're doing the things they're doing with the numbers that you see from Steve Moore. And they're not that stupid. I mean, this is not unintentional. This is obvious error, and I think they know it. And the people in this room are the people who are going to have to fight back against that.
Well, so Andy, can I show you just one more chart? Can you put those charts up again? I wanted to show you one other thing that amplifies the point that you were just making, Andy. And this is, well, first of all,
Andy, I just want to, actually, Brian Dees is a BlackRock alumnus, one of many in the administration. So
that's right. He came from BlackRock.
That is.
I forgot to mention
that explains everything.
Well, part of it. worth pointing out.
So here's the spending spree that we talked about. You know, look, we spent a lot under Trump to deal with COVID, and then we came in with the $3 trillion extra. So this is more money than we spent on World War II, adjusted inflation. But I want to show you one other thing. that I think is really important. This is the Biden energy strategy. And I'm always asked when I give talks about the economy, are these people doing this intentionally? By the way, how many of you think they're doing this intentionally? A lot of people do. I don't know if it is, but if it were intentional, they're doing a pretty good job of it. And the way you destroy a country's economy, or a good way to do it, is to destroy its energy supply, right? Now, so look at the green line there that goes straight up. That, Andy, that's the shale revolution. That was incredibly, that's the story of America, these incredible new technologies that tripled in 8 years our oil and gas output. And the left and you can see we were above Russia and Saudi Arabia when Trump left office. We were actually exporting oil and gas. Now you see how that green line goes straight down? Effectively, that is the Biden energy strategy. I mean, can you imagine anything more destructive to a country's economy than to destroy its energy supply? We get 7% of our energy from wind and solar power. Even if we were able to triple that, Vivek, where are we going to get the other 80% of our energy? This will destroy our economy, and yet this bill that apparently they've agreed on is another $50 billion for this climate change agenda, which is a cancer to our economy. So that is so problematic, and we have to stop that.
Well, the other important thing on your chart, Steve, is, and you're probably all aware of this, but if you're not, I thought I'd point it out, Russia is actually producing more oil now than it did prior to the pandemic.
Yeah, and making more money.
We're the ones who are producing less oil than we did prior to the pandemic. So when they talk about the price of oil going up and it's Putin's not doing it. Putin's producing more oil than he did before the pandemic. We're going to spend all our time on one question if we can.
And meanwhile, coal.
Which we could, by the way.
I want to bring Vivek in here.
And by the way, China right now, there's a big story in the Financial Times. Right now, as we sit here, China is building 30 new coal-fired plants. And they're building the biggest coal plant in the history of the world. Does anybody in this room or in this country, other than John Kerry, really believe that the Chinese care about climate change? I guarantee you they don't. They care about global domination. And unfortunately, Andy, our policies are playing right into their hands.
All right, gentlemen, we need to get to our second question. We got a lot to cover here. And I did think, what Andy, I wanted to key on something he said because it was so important. There's the hard way to tackle this problem and the easier way, the much more beneficial way, and that's the supply side way that you've been talking about. And there's some really needed, I think, recognition that's deserved from many of you that have been doing that at the state level. And then I want to bring Vivek in to talk about breach of fiduciary duty and the pension issue that we want to talk about. And that is this session, ladies and gentlemen, did you realize it took 110 years for the first 4 states to go from progressive tax systems to flat taxes? 110 years from the first state income tax in Wisconsin in 1911 to the present. In a 10-week period, we had 4 new flat tax states this year and across the sessions. And what an incredible accomplishment. And so where's our friends from Iowa? Governor Reynolds, John Wills, starting with Speaker Uppmeyer several years ago, became the first. Where's our friends in Arizona under the leadership of President Fan and Vince Leach and our Arizona delegation? Mississippi, and then our home state delegation here in Georgia. Those, ladies and gentlemen, were the 4 new flat tax states that are doing exactly what you're talking about on the supply side.
Well, obviously, they're reading Rich States, Poor States.
They're reading Rich States, Poor States. So, Vivek, to bring you in, you made some really important comments on fiduciary duty, breach of fiduciary rules. Did anybody see what Ron DeSantis, governor of Florida, and who's a Ron DeSantis fan here, by the way? We've got to have a lot of Ron DeSantis fans. He had a great press conference yesterday working with many of our friends. I know, Andy, you've been working with them. Vivek, you and your team have. This issue of keeping politics out of pension systems. You mentioned the takeover of the Exxon board from these activists. Pension systems are voting their shares against the interest of management in these cases, against the free market interest. Talk to us a little bit about that and what state legislators can do to fight back and get politics out of pensions.
Absolutely, and I had the privilege of spending an hour with him the day before that press conference. I think it's great to see some leadership actually coming from the states. I'm going to see if I can't actually tie this into the discussion that we just had on energy, just to make it tangible and real by way of example. Yes, the Biden administration is responsible for a lot of the shackles imposed on the U.S. energy sector. He's keeping a campaign promise, right? He said in September 2019, I guarantee you we're going to end fossil fuels. That's an exact quote. That green line down is actually, it was up there on the chart, that green line, downward line, that was keeping a campaign promise, right? And so now, willing to beg every dictator around the world to produce more oil while imposing the very regulations that prevent us from doing it here at home, this is actually staggering, right? Going hand in hand abroad, while the leader of the free world could have had his own companies doing it here at home if the market could actually do its work. A lot to say about the Biden administration. However, there's one sense in which he's narrowly right in blaming the private sector, but it's not the sense he means. The private sector is in parallel imposing equal, in some cases even greater constraints on domestic energy production as well, because the money of our own citizens is being used to force that onto Exxon and Chevron and every other major US energy company. That's mystifying, right? Well, I'll give you one example. Exxon we talked about. Let's talk about Chevron. They voluntarily, by shareholder force, adopted a Scope 3 emissions cap. What does that mean? It means that Chevron as a company has to take responsibility for not just its own emissions, but not only double and triple counting, it's 10 times counting every unit of oil that they ship even upstream as well as downstream for every Amazon Prime delivery that's made. Chevron has to now take responsibility. Say an electric vehicle is delivered to your door. The fossil fuels that it takes to burn that are now Chevron's own responsibility because of a mandate imposed on them by BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. But whose money were they using to impose that agenda on Chevron? It was that of your constituents. It was that of the everyday citizens in this country and the pension fund money that accidentally, I think in many cases it was accident, voted in favor of that agenda. And so I think that is a large-scale problem that can be fixed not through lawmaking, but to take that capital back and really direct it to market actors other than BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard and ESG-linked asset managers to put an agenda back. First, again, in the energy industry and in every other one, to tell companies to focus exclusively on doing what's best for selling great products and services to the market. That includes oil and natural gas too, rather than advancing these social and political agendas. And as it relates to U.S. energy, the one point I will make is the farce at the heart of this is actually, it's evident in so many places, but one of the other places it's evident is in the opposition of that same movement to the one source of deliverance of energy efficiency in a way that also doesn't actually contribute to carbon emissions, which is nuclear energy. So the same movement that opposes that fossil fuel agenda also opposes nuclear energy. In fact, Vanguard's ESG funds, by rule, systematically exclude nuclear energy. Ask yourself why. And part of it, I believe, is that nuclear energy is too good at solving the problem. What does that mean? If you solve the energy crisis, you might have accidentally solved the problem that otherwise would have served as a vehicle for advancing many other agendas that had nothing to do with energy. If you rely on wind and solar, it's necessarily a cap on Western and American growth that allow the colonialized world or whatever the worldview may be to catch up. That's what's going on, is that cultural agenda takes shape in the form of these economic mandates imposed by the private sector, large shareholders onto corporate America. That's going to be easier for states to fix.
Let me add one thing. This is really important for the state legislators in this room. And there is kind of a solution to this, quote, crisis of climate change. And it's important because most of your states now have these insidious renewable energy standards that require your utilities to use 30 or 40 or 50%. In some cases, I think California wants to go to 100% renewable energy. One thing we can do as a movement to at least reduce the negative impact of this is to do what Europe has done. Europe has now defined nuclear power and natural gas as clean energy sources of energy. And guess what? They are clean energy sources. So what you need to do in your states is change your renewable energy requirements. Well, you should get rid of them altogether. But if you don't get rid of them altogether, you should redefine what clean energy is to include, yes, clean nuclear power, and yes, natural gas. The reason the United States is the country of all the countries in the world has reduced our carbon emissions the most. By the way, raise your hand if you knew that. The United States, most Americans don't know that because nobody ever tells them. The major reason we've been able to do that is two words: natural gas. And yet there's another example. Why in the world is the left against natural gas? Because it's cheap and abundant and it's made in America. That's why they're against it. So.
Well, if even Europe can get it right on energy, folks, right?
Yeah, right.
So I want to give the final word here to Andy, because you've given a lot of thought to this issue back on the fiduciary piece, and we have the new ALEC model on that. So for all of you that want to get politics out of your pension systems, that are concerned about what's been talked about on ESG and many of these other topics, Andy, bring us home here.
Sure. To just kind of summarize what Vivek was talking about, we do have ESG investing in this country as an effort by corporate and governmental leads to use the American private sector as a tool around the ballot box, as a tool to avoid the messiness and inconvenience of our democracy. It's a challenge, it's a threat to our democracy, it's a threat to our economic freedom, and it's a threat to our individual liberty. We have to fight back against this. But every state in this room, every one of you, every one of your states uses BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard to manage funds. They're voting against the economic interests of the beneficiaries of the funds that are invested in your state, and they're voting against the beliefs of people. If you're in a red state, they're voting against the beliefs and the political leanings of the people in your state. So what we've done at ALEC, we've come up with a bill that it's called the State Fiduciary Duty Bill, and it takes provisions from ERISA, it takes a regulation that Gene Scalia got passed under ERISA, and it basically says for our state to comply with your fiduciary duties to the beneficiaries of our funds, you cannot invest for political purposes. You can only invest in the pecuniary or monetary interests of the beneficiaries of those funds. Now, that may not sound like a wild idea, but ESG investing is opposed exactly to that notion. ESG investing says you don't invest to generate shareholder returns. You invest to accomplish leftist political goals. And until you pass a law, either this ALEC law or a law like it, the funds in your state will continue to be used to advocate for a leftist political agenda that includes not only green energy, it includes the social justice, these social HR policies where you teach your employees that they're either victims or victimized. Why would you teach your employees that? You've got to be an idiot, CEO, to teach your employees that. Or these government policies where you put people on your board of directors not based on their qualifications, their merits, or their character, but based on their race or their sex, which is something I fought against my whole professional career, but now seems to be the in thing. But it also goes even further to where we've got companies that the funds from your state are invested in, are taking your money, the shareholders' money, the money that should go to the people, the beneficiaries of these funds in your states, and investing them in things like defunding the police, support for Black Lives Matter, right? Or to send women to states to get abortions that may not be in compliance with the laws in your state. They're using your money, the money that should go to the people on whose behalf you're supposed to be investing. So we have something called the State Fiduciary Duty Bill. What's the exact title, Jonathan? The
Employee Protection Act, yeah.
Okay. Anyway, and Mike Thompson, I don't know where Mike is, but he's got a breakout session on this coming up shortly.
Yep.
This is an important piece of legislation. I can't think of anything you could do in your state that would be more important than stopping BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. Why are you letting them vote and spend your money?
Mm-hmm. Well, very good. Well said, Andy. And unfortunately, folks, we are out of time for this amazing panel, but please join me in thanking these fine speakers and economic leaders. Boy, we face some challenges, don't we, as an economy and as a nation going forward with people like that and with the great work that you're doing, ALEC members leading the way in the states. I'm optimistic for the future, for sure. Now, we had a great, exciting panel, but right now we wanted to also recognize a bit of a somber moment, and that's that time since we gathered a year ago at Salt Lake City for that amazing annual meeting there in Utah. we have lost a few of our ALEC free market heroes in the past year. And these are individuals that anyone who has worked in the free market policy world knows and has worked with. And if you haven't worked with them, folks, you benefit from the policies that they spent their lives advocating for, the free market policies, the mission of ALEC. And as you can see here on the slide, our great friend Lou Euler from California, who is responsible for Prop 13 and the kind of taxpayer protections in California, as well as one of the first attendees at the very first ALEC gathering nearly 50 years ago. Missouri Senator Ed Emery, a board member, a state chair for the Missouri delegation, and task force chair in our tax and fiscal policy task force, and the great Bob Williams, an ALEC staff member, the leader, founder of the state think tank community in Washington State, and just such a great hero for those who us believe in good budgeting and pension reform ideas that we talked about today. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a moment of silence to honor the great memories of three individuals that made a difference for ALEC and, more importantly, made a difference for freedom across the United States. Well, thank you very much. And this brings the end to our main stage programming for this morning's session, but there are very many more things that you will enjoy directly following this session, including a meeting of the Suburban Caucus, workshops on how to fight inflation through fiscal responsibility, professional licensing, and how to get states to fight back against this radical interpretation of ESG that we talked about during this session, as well as the meeting of our American City-County Exchange, our ACE program for city and county officials, and our Innovation Roundtable and Women's Caucus Roundtable. Folks, it's been a great morning. Happy Thursday, everyone. Look forward to working with you the rest of the day.